The nurse's voice was calm but urgent when she said, "Caroline, she's been waiting to tell you something, and I don't think there's much time." I stood in my classroom at Eisenhower Elementary, chalk dust still on my fingers, holding a phone call I had dreaded for 28 years. Her name was Teresa Namdi, a night charge nurse at Brookhaven Senior Living, and she had never once called me before that Tuesday. "Your grandmother has asked for you every single day this week," she said, "and I promised her I would finally make you listen." I almost said no. I want you to understand that first, because it matters more than anything else in this story I'm telling you. For 28 years, I had let one sentence define an entire woman, and I never once gave her the chance to explain it. Now, I know exactly what you think this story is going to become: a granddaughter's guilt, a deathbed apology, a tidy little redemption. That's not what this is. This is a story about how a single lie, told at exactly the right moment, can steal decades. I'll be honest, there was an inheritance involved, and I'll get to every dollar of it, but the money was never the actual point. What my grandmother had been waiting to tell me wasn't really about money at all. It was about a sentence she never said. Researchers at AR found in a 2025 study that grandparents invest an average of $2, $600, and over 500 hours yearly supporting their grandchildren. My grandmother spent 28 years locked out of doing either one, and I was the reason, though I didn't understand that yet. So here's the one thing I'll ask you before I tell you the rest, because these stories always seem to ask something first. If you've ever let one cruel sentence define somebody in your family for years without ever once asking if it was even true, subscribe. Because this is a story about how easily we let one version of the truth calcify into fact, simply because nobody corrected it in time. My name is Caroline Ashby. I'm 46 years old, and I teach second grade at Eisenhower Elementary on the east side of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've taught second grade for 19 years now, ever since I finished my education degree at the University of Tulsa in 2004. My grandmother was Eleanor Voss, 89 years old, who had lived in that same small house on Quincy Avenue for over 50 years. My apartment sits 11 miles from Quincy Avenue, close enough that I passed Eleanor's old street almost every week without ever once stopping. Eleanor had worked as a school librarian for 31 years before retiring, the same kind of quiet, patient job I eventually chose myself. She moved into Brookhaven Senior Living in the fall of 2022 after a bad fall in her kitchen that broke her hip badly. My grandfather, Walter Voss, died of a heart attack in 2001, leaving Eleanor alone in that house on Quincy Avenue for over 2 decades. I hadn't spoken to her directly, not once, not a single phone call, since I was 16 years old, back in the spring of 1994. That was the year my parents divorced, loudly and bitterly, in a way that split our entire extended family down the middle. My parents' divorce dragged on for 11 brutal months, with lawyers, custody hearings, and a level of cruelty neither of them ever fully recovered from. My mother told me, sitting at our kitchen table with red, swollen eyes, exactly what my grandmother had supposedly said about her. I remember the exact chair I was sitting in at our kitchen table when my mother told me what Eleanor had supposedly said. She said Eleanor told my father, "Your wife trapped you into this marriage, and she never once deserved to be part of this family?" I was 16. I believed my mother completely, and I never questioned a single word of what she told me that afternoon. I stopped taking Eleanor's calls. I sent back her birthday cards unopened. I refused to attend a single holiday where she'd be present. By the time I turned 20, I had convinced myself Eleanor's silence was proof of guilt, not evidence of a family keeping her quiet. My father's sister, my aunt, Deborah Voss Hanley, 59 at the time, quietly encouraged my silence, calling Eleanor difficult every chance she got. Deborah managed most of Eleanor's finances after my grandfather died in 2001, and she never once suggested I reconsider my anger toward her. Deborah sent Christmas cards every year signed only with her own name, never once mentioning Eleanor, as if she'd quietly erased her from our family. For 28 years, I attended exactly 4 family events where Eleanor was present, 3 funerals and 1 cousin's wedding, and spoke to her never. I built an entire adult life, believing my grandmother was a bitter, unkind woman who had never once wanted my mother in the family. I built a life that looked complete from the outside, a teaching job, a small brick house, a daughter I adored, and a grandmother-shaped hole. I married, had a daughter named Maya, divorced eventually myself, and never once thought to ask Eleanor what actually happened that spring in 1994. My mother passed away in 2019 from ovarian cancer, and even at her funeral, I did not speak more than 10 words to Eleanor. Deborah stood beside me that day and whispered, Don't let her guilt you now. She's always been this way. Don't forget what she said. I didn't forget. I carried that sentence like a stone in my chest for 28 years, never once questioning where it actually came from. So when Teresa called me that Tuesday afternoon, my first instinct, embarrassingly, was to let it go to voicemail like I always had. Something made me answer, and I still can't fully explain what that something was, except that Teresa's voice sounded genuinely frightened for Eleanor. I drove to Brookhaven straight from school, still in the same cardigan I'd worn to teach 22 second graders about fractions that morning. Teresa met me in the hallway before I even reached Eleanor's room, and she said something that stopped me cold at the door. She's been asking for you specifically for 6 months, Teresa said. Not your aunt, not your cousins, only you every single day. She keeps saying there's something she needs you to know before it's too late, and I promised her I'd get you here. Teresa told me later that Eleanor had specifically asked her not to call Deborah, saying she'll only find another reason to stop this. I asked Teresa how long she had personally suspected something in our family story didn't quite add up before that Tuesday call. About 4 months, she told me honestly, the day Eleanor cried herself quietly to sleep saying your name over and over again. Eleanor's room was small, clean, and quiet, with a single window overlooking a courtyard, and she looked impossibly smaller than I remembered her. She reached for my hand the moment she saw me, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman who could no longer stand on her own. Caroline, she said, her voice thin but steady, I need to tell you what I actually said to your father in 1994. I sat down slowly, my whole body suddenly cold, because some part of me had never once considered that the story might be wrong. Eleanor told me, word by careful word, that she never once said my mother trapped my father or didn't deserve our family. What she actually said, on a phone call your father recorded without her knowing, was this. Leave him, honey. He's not who you think. Eleanor had learned, weeks before the divorce became public, that my father was having an affair with a coworker named Patricia Ellery. She called my mother privately to warn her, gently, without judgment, and told her she deserved better than a man who would do that. My father, furious his own mother had taken my mother's side, twisted that conversation into the cruel sentence my mother later repeated to me. He told my mother that Eleanor had actually said the opposite, betting correctly that a devastated, humiliated woman wouldn't call his own mother to check. My mother, drowning in grief and rage during the worst weeks of her life, believed him completely, the same way I believed her at 16. Eleanor tried calling my mother to correct it within days, but by then the story had already hardened into something nobody wanted to examine. I tried for years, Eleanor told me, tears sliding sideways into the pillow beside her face, but nobody would let me finish a sentence. Every time she reached out, Deborah or my father intercepted the call, told her I wasn't ready, told her to give it time. Time, Eleanor said, turned into 28 years, Caroline, and I am not going to have enough of it left to fix this properly. Eleanor kept the phone recording of that original conversation for years, on an old cassette tape she was too afraid to ever play for anyone. She told me she was terrified that even proof wouldn't matter anymore, that 28 years might have hardened past any real correction. I sat there holding my grandmother's hand, trying to reconcile 28 years of resentment with a woman who had only tried to protect us. Teresa quietly stepped out and returned a few minutes later carrying a small metal lockbox that Eleanor had asked her to keep safe for months. She had me bring this from her old house before she moved here, Teresa said, in case she never got to explain it herself. Inside were 28 birthday cards, one for every year since I turned 16, each one signed, dated, and never once mailed to me. There was also a savings bond, opened in my name the same spring of 1994, that Eleanor had quietly added to every single year since. Researchers who study estrangement note that reconciliation attempts are frequently blocked not by the estranged parties themselves, but by relatives managing the narrative between them. That was exactly what happened in my family for 28 straight years, and I never once thought to question who was actually managing the story. The bond, according to the paperwork Teresa handed me, had grown to just over $31, zero, meant originally for my college, now meant for Maya's. I didn't want you to think I bought your forgiveness, Eleanor said quietly. I only wanted you to know I never once stopped trying. I asked her why she never simply told me directly, showed up at my door, forced the conversation the way I would have expected. I asked her why she never simply mailed me the cassette tape instead of waiting for me to finally walk through her door. Some truths, she said quietly, felt like they needed a voice behind them, not just paper, not just a tape nobody would trust. I sat with that answer for a long time, understanding finally that Eleanor had been protecting the relationship even while trying to save it. You were 16 and grieving, she said. I thought forcing it would only prove your mother right about what kind of woman I was. So instead, she waited, hoping someone in the family would eventually let the truth through, not understanding that nobody ever intended to. I thought about Deborah's words at my mother's funeral, "Don't let her guilt you now," and understood finally how deliberately that sentence had been chosen. Deborah wasn't protecting me from Eleanor. Deborah was protecting a version of the family story that had made my father look blameless for decades. I am not going to confront Deborah publicly or demand she account for 28 years of quiet interference, and I want to tell you why. Deborah spent her whole life believing loyalty meant defending her brother no matter what, and nothing I say now will undo that particular blindness. I got the one thing Deborah will never have, which is an honest, complete relationship with my grandmother in whatever time remains for her. My father passed away in 2016, still believing, as far as any of us knew, that his lie had simply disappeared with time. I've since wondered whether he ever felt guilty, or whether Patricia Ellery, the woman he left my mother for, ever even knew the full story. Eleanor told me she forgave my father decades ago, not because what he did was forgivable, but because carrying the anger cost her too much. Maya asks about Eleanor constantly now, wanting every story from before the silence, hungry for a grandmother she almost never got to meet. No family argument could ever hand Deborah that, and honestly, I've stopped needing her to understand what she cost both of us. I moved into the guest room at my own house that same week and started making the 20-minute drive to Brookhaven every single evening. Eleanor and I talked for hours some nights, about nothing important, about everything important, trying to compress 28 lost years into whatever time was left. She told me about Patricia Ellery, about my father's affair, about details of that spring I had never once been told by anyone. I learned my father had asked Eleanor, directly, to simply say nothing and let the story stand, and she had refused, quietly, for years. I couldn't lie to protect him, she told me, but I also couldn't force you to believe me over your own mother's grief. That's the part that broke me open the most, that Eleanor chose honesty even when honesty cost her the one relationship she wanted most. A 2020 National Academies report found nearly a quarter of community-dwelling Americans over 65 are socially isolated, often by circumstances outside their own control. My grandmother wasn't isolated by circumstance. She was isolated by a lie, maintained carefully by people who benefited from her staying quiet. I brought Maya to meet her great-grandmother for the first time 3 weeks ago, and Eleanor cried when she said Maya's name out loud. Maya asks about Eleanor constantly now, wanting to know every story from before the silence, hungry for a grandmother she almost never got to meet. I bought her presents every year too, Eleanor admitted. I just never knew where to send them, so I kept them in that same box. Maya, 15 and unaware of any of this history, simply hugged her and said, "I'm really glad I get to know you now." I watched my daughter give my grandmother something 28 years of silence had stolen from all three of us without any of us choosing it. I used to think my grandmother was simply a cold, difficult woman, the way my mother described her during the worst weeks of her life. I know now she was a woman who told an inconvenient truth once, and then spent decades quietly paying for telling it. The lockbox, the birthday cards, the $31, zero bond, none of that was ever the actual inheritance that mattered here. Not really, not truly. The real inheritance was the truth, finally spoken out loud in a small room at Brookhaven, before it was almost too late to matter. Silence, I've learned the hard way at 46, isn't always chosen by the person accused of causing it in the first place. Sometimes silence is engineered, carefully, by people who benefit from a family never once asking the one question that would unravel everything. I don't say that to excuse the 28 years I spent refusing her calls, sending back her cards, believing the version I was handed. I say it because understanding how a lie gets built doesn't erase the years it cost, it just finally gives those years a shape. If I could go back and tell 16-year-old me one thing, I would tell her to call her grandmother and ask her directly. Not to believe either parent blindly, not yet, not while still grieving, but simply to ask the one question nobody thought to ask. I make these videos for people who've spent years defending a story they inherited secondhand, without ever once checking where that story actually came from. So here's my question for you tonight, the one I've been sitting with since Teresa's phone call interrupted my Tuesday afternoon at school. Is there a version of someone in your family you've never once questioned because the story simply arrived and nobody challenged it? Don't tell me the whole story if you're not ready. Just tell me in the comments whether you've ever asked the person directly. Because my grandmother waited 28 years for someone to finally ask her side and almost ran out of time before anyone did. If this story reached you, if you've ever let someone else's version of a person replace your own chance to find out, subscribe and stay. I'll keep making these for people carrying an inherited grudge, because a nurse's phone call taught me mine was built on somebody else's lie. Eleanor is still with us, weaker every week, but present, and we are using whatever time remains to finally know each other properly. I am not angry at my father the way I thought I would be when I first learned the truth in that small room. I am angry at 28 years, at every missed birthday, every unanswered card, every version of Eleanor I never gave a chance to correct. I visit her every evening now, and some nights we don't talk about any of it, we just watch television and eat cafeteria pudding. Those ordinary nights, honestly, are the ones I think I'll remember longest, not the reveal, not the lockbox, just her hand in mine. Teresa still checks on us sometimes, off the clock, and she told me last week she's never seen Eleanor smile that much before. She kept saying you'd come eventually, Teresa told me. She just didn't think it would take this long to finally get through. I think about that sentence a lot, that Eleanor never once stopped believing I would come, even after 28 years of silence. That kind of patient, stubborn hope is its own quiet inheritance, one Deborah never had to offer and one money could never buy. I told Deborah, gently, that I know the truth now, and she didn't deny it. She just said, I was trying to protect the family. I told her the family she was protecting was already broken. She just hadn't wanted to be the one who finally admitted it. We haven't spoken since, and I've made peace with that, because some relationships aren't worth rebuilding just to keep the family looking whole. Eleanor asked me last week if I was angry at her for waiting so long to force the conversation, and I told her the truth. I told her I understood why a grieving 16-year-old girl seemed like the wrong person to burden with an ugly, complicated adult truth. I told her I only wish anyone, had trusted me sooner with something as simple as the actual facts of what happened. She squeezed my hand and said, I trust you now, and that's going to have to be enough for whatever time we have left. It is enough. It has to be, because 28 years already happened, and I refuse to spend whatever remains grieving what we lost instead. If you're holding on to a story about someone in your family that you've never once verified, I am asking you, gently, to go check. Not because the truth will always be comfortable, mine certainly wasn't, but because a stranger's phone call shouldn't be the only way you learn it. Teresa didn't have to push that hard to get me to answer my phone that Tuesday. She could have simply logged the missed call. She kept pushing because she told me later she could see, every single day, exactly how much my visit would mean to Eleanor. I think about Teresa almost as often as I think about Eleanor these days, a nurse who fought harder for us than family did. That's the other lesson sitting inside all of this, that sometimes the people who fight hardest for our relationships aren't related to us at all. So I'll ask you again, one final time, because I think it's the only question in this whole story that actually matters in the end. Who in your life has a version of events you've simply accepted, and what would it honestly cost you to finally go verify it? I almost didn't call my grandmother back before it was too late, and I am asking you not to make that same mistake with yours. Thank you for staying with me through all of this tonight. My name is Caroline Ashby, and my grandmother's name is Eleanor Voss. The thing she left me wasn't the lockbox or the bond, it was 28 years of proof that she never once stopped waiting for me.